Divorced my husband the day after our wedding because he smashed my face into our cake after I told him not to. Then his whole family says I'm overreacting. I really need some perspective here because I'm starting to feel like I'm going crazy with everyone telling me I'm overreacting. I'm not sure if I'm the a-hole in this situation, but this has been eating me up inside and I don't know who else to talk to. I met Jake about 4 years ago at my cousin's birthday party. He was charming, funny, and we hit it off right away. We started dating and things moved pretty quickly. He was always the life of the party, constantly joking around and making everyone laugh. I loved that about him at first, how he could light up a room and make everyone feel comfortable. After about 3 years together, he proposed. It was during a vacation we took to this little beach town. Nothing huge, just a nice dinner and a walk on the beach where he got down on one knee. I said yes immediately. I was so happy and excited to start planning our future together. Looking back, there were signs I should have paid more attention to. Jake had this way of sometimes taking jokes too far. Like this one time when we were at his friend's birthday, he pushed his face into his own birthday cake as a joke and everyone laughed, but the birthday guy was clearly embarrassed. Or when he replaced his mom's sugar with salt on April Fool's Day, and she ended up having to throw away an entire batch of cookies she was making for some church event. She was pissed, but he just laughed it off. I always brushed these things off because they seemed harmless enough, and he was always so apologetic afterwards if anyone got genuinely upset. He'd say things like, "I was just trying to make everyone laugh," or "It's just a joke. Don't be so serious." And I believed him. I thought he just got carried away sometimes but meant well. It all started going downhill a few months before the wedding. I noticed Jake watching these stupid prank videos on his phone all the time. He would laugh his ass off at these videos showing brides getting humiliated, their faces smashed into cakes, embarrassing photos of them being shown to everyone during speeches, grooms pretending to drop the rings or run away at the altar, that kind of thing. One night, we were sitting on the couch and he kept showing me these videos, laughing hysterically while I just sat there, not finding any of it funny. I immediately told him I didn't want anything like that at our wedding. I was very clear. I said I'd spend a lot of money on my makeup and dress and didn't want either ruined. Plus, I didn't think publicly humiliating your new spouse was a great way to start a marriage. He just laughed and said, "Don't worry, babe. I'm not planning anything like that. I know you're too uptight for that kind of stuff." The uptight comment annoyed me, but I let it slide because at least he seemed to understand that I didn't want any pranks at our wedding. I believed him, but over the next few weeks, I started noticing weird stuff. He kept having these hush phone calls with his friends. He would immediately hang up or change the subject when I walked into the room. At first, I thought maybe he was planning some sort of surprise for me, like a honeymoon thing or something. Then he suddenly wanted to be involved in wedding decisions he previously couldn't care less about, especially the cake and the photographer. At the time, I was just happy he was showing interest in the wedding planning because before that, he'd left everything to me. I thought maybe he was finally taking our wedding seriously and wanted to be more involved. I was actually happy about it. But then I started noticing strange comments from his friends. When we were at a dinner with his best friend Tom and his girlfriend, Tom kept making these weird comments about how the wedding would be one to remember and go down in history. They'd look at each other and snicker and Jake would kick him under the table. When I asked what was so funny, they'd just say inside joke and change the subject. Another red flag happened when we went for our cake tasting. Jake kept asking weird questions about the sturdiness of the cake and how much weight the frosting could hold. The baker looked confused and I just assumed he didn't know much about cakes. He also insisted on a certain type of thick frosting that would photograph well. I was just happy he was participating, so I went along with it. About 2 weeks before the wedding, Jake's brother Frank came over for dinner. Frank has always been the complete opposite of Jake. Quiet, thoughtful, and serious. We were talking about the wedding plans, and Frank asked if we were doing any special traditions. Before I could answer, Jake made some comment about special surprises and winked at Frank. Frank didn't seem amused and asked what he meant. Jake just brushed it off, but Frank gave him this long hard look that I didn't understand at the time. The day before the wedding, I had this weird feeling in my gut that something was off. I couldn't shake it. I pulled Jake aside after the rehearsal dinner and specifically reminded him that if he pulled any kind of prank at our wedding, especially anything that would ruin my appearance or embarrass me, I would seriously reconsider our relationship. He got all defensive and was like, "Jesus, you're paranoid. I already told you I'm not doing anything." Then he made me feel guilty by saying I was ruining the mood before our wedding by assuming the worst of him. I felt bad for not trusting him, but obviously my instincts were right. The morning of the wedding was hectic, but exciting. My bridesmaids and mom helped me get ready. My makeup artist spent almost 2 hours on my face, and I felt beautiful. My dress was perfect. I'd saved for months to afford it, and it fit like a glove after 3 separate fittings. Everyone kept telling me how gorgeous I looked, and I was so excited to see Jake's face when I walked down the aisle. The ceremony went perfectly. Jake looked handsome in his tux, and he actually teared up when I walked down the aisle, which made me cry too. We said our vows, exchanged rings, and had our first kiss as a married couple. Everything felt magical, and I thought all my worries had been for nothing. Then came the reception. Everything was going great at first. We had our first dance. The speeches were lovely, though Jake's best man, Tom, made a few comments about Jake's sense of humor that made me a bit nervous. And the food was amazing. Then it was time for the cake cutting. The cake was beautiful. 3 tiers with white fondant and these delicate sugar flowers that match my bouquet. Everyone gathered around to watch us cut it together. The photographer was positioned right in front of us to capture the moment. Jake and I held the knife together and made the first cut. The crowd cheered and I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. Then it happened. As I was about to feed Jake a small piece of cake, I felt his hand firmly on the back of my head. Before I could react, he pushed my face hard into the cake. Not just a little nudge, but forcefully shoving my entire face into it. My makeup was completely ruined, and there was frosting all over my face, in my hair, and all down the front of my dress. The worst part, the whole room erupted in laughter with Jake laughing the loudest. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The photographer was snapping picture after picture, and Jake had his arm around my frosting-covered shoulders saying, "This is going to be our wedding photo." Like, it was the funniest thing ever. I was in complete shock for a few seconds. Then I just turned around and slapped him across the face. The laughter immediately died down and Jake looked stunned, his cheek red from where I'd hit him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I yelled, tears already streaming down my face and mixing with the frosting. "I told you not to do this." Jake's expression quickly changed from shock to annoyance. "It's just a joke, babe. Calm down. You're making a scene." That's when I lost it. I stormed off, pushing past guests who were now awkwardly standing there, not knowing what to do. I heard my mother calling after me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight to the bridal suite and locked the door behind me. I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized myself. My makeup was ruined with streaks of mascara and frosting covering my face. My hair, which had taken hours to style, was now sticky with frosting. And my dress, my beautiful, expensive dress that I'd spent months searching for, had a huge frosting stain down the front that I knew would never come out completely. I tried to clean myself up as best I could, but it was useless. My makeup was beyond saving, and all I could do was wipe off the frosting and try to fix my hair. I was so angry I was shaking. I couldn't believe Jake had done this to me after I specifically told him not to and after he promised he wouldn't. I must have been in there for about 20 minutes when I heard shouting from the reception hall. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it got louder and louder. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I could tell people were arguing. Despite everything, I was curious about what was happening, so I cracked open the door and peeked out. I could now hear the shouting more clearly. And to my surprise, it was Frank's voice, Jake's usually quiet and reserved brother. I couldn't see what was happening from where I was, but I could hear Frank yelling things like, "You never changed and you promised her you wouldn't do this." After a few more minutes, the shouting died down, and there was a knock at the door of the bridal suite. "It's Frank." His face was flushed, and he looked more upset than I'd ever seen him. "Are you okay?" he asked. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak without crying again. "Jake has something he wants to say to you," Frank said, his jaw tight. "If you're willing to hear him out." I honestly didn't want to see Jake at that moment, but I nodded anyway. Frank disappeared for a minute and came back with Jake, who was looking at the floor. "Look at her," Frank said. Jake reluctantly raised his eyes to meet mine. "I'm sorry," Jake mumbled, not sounding sorry at all. "Look her in the eyes when you apologize," Frank said, his tone making even me flinch. Jake straightened up a bit and looked directly at me. "I'm sorry." "Okay." I didn't think he'd react like this. It was just supposed to be funny. I could tell he didn't mean it. He was only apologizing because Frank was making him, not because he actually thought he'd done anything wrong. The realization hit me hard. This man who I just vowed to spend my life with had deliberately ignored my clearly stated boundary, humiliated me in front of all our friends and family, and didn't even understand why I was upset. The weird thing was seeing Frank so angry. In the 4 years I'd known him, he'd always been this really chill, gentle guy. I've literally never seen him raise his voice before, so seeing him all red-faced and pissed off was honestly kind of scary. It was like he was a completely different person. Frank insisted on walking us back into the reception, which was now awkwardly silent. Everyone was just looking down at their plates or suddenly very interested in their drinks. Some people were whispering to each other, probably about the drama they just witnessed. The DJ tried to lighten the mood by playing an upbeat song, but no one was in the party mood anymore. I sat at our table, picking at my food and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Jake tried to act like nothing had happened, laughing and talking with his friends, occasionally putting his arm around me as if everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. I was humiliated, angry, and worst of all, I felt betrayed by the person who was supposed to love and respect me most. The rest of the reception was painfully uncomfortable, and it ended much earlier than planned. Many guests made excuses to leave early, probably sensing the tension. By 10 p.m., what was supposed to be a celebration until midnight was basically over. I was so upset, I couldn't even stand to be near Jake. So, when Frank offered to drive me back to our apartment, I accepted immediately. Jake seemed annoyed, but didn't argue, probably because Frank was still giving him death glares every time he opened his mouth. The car ride was quiet at first. I was staring out the window trying not to cry again when Frank broke the silence. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said. "And I'm sorry for losing my temper back there. I don't usually. It's just I've seen this too many times." "What do you mean?" I asked. Frank sighed deeply. Jake's always been like this, using special occasions to humiliate people for his own amusement. He thinks it's hilarious. He went on to tell me how when they were kids, Jake would throw cake at him on his birthdays or accidentally break his presents. One year, Jake replaced Frank's birthday candles with those trick ones that don't blow out. And when Frank got frustrated, Jake pushed his face into the cake in front of all his friends. Another time, Jake switched Frank's graduation gown with one several sizes too small just before the ceremony, making him scramble to find something to wear at the last minute. Their parents never did anything about it, just brushed it off as boys being boys, or that's just how brothers are. Frank said he'd spent his whole life enduring Jake's pranks, but seeing him do it to me on our wedding day was the final straw. He realized his brother wasn't just immature. He was actually a bad person who enjoyed humiliating others. I should have warned you, Frank said. I've seen how he treats people, how he treats you sometimes, but I thought maybe he'd changed or that he wouldn't pull this on his wedding day of all days. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. It's not your fault, I told him. I should have seen the signs myself. We sat in silence for a moment before I asked the question that had been on my mind since the cake incident. Do you think I'd be overreacting if I left him over this? Frank didn't hesitate. No. Honestly, you deserve better than someone who gets off on humiliating you. And I don't give a damn how Jake feels about it because he brought it on himself. Before dropping me off, Frank offered to help me collect my things from our apartment if I decided to leave. Jake, he gave me his number and told me to call him anytime if I needed anything. It was the first time since the incident that I felt like someone was actually on my side. I spent that night alone in our apartment thinking about everything that had happened. Jake texted me several times asking where I was and why I hadn't come to the hotel with him. We were supposed to spend our wedding night at this fancy hotel before leaving for our honeymoon the next day. I ignored his messages. By morning, I'd made my decision. I texted Jake that I wanted a divorce. His response came almost immediately. Are you kidding me? Over a cake? Don't be ridiculous. I didn't respond, but over the next few hours, the texts started coming in from his family and even some of mine. His mother called me dramatic and said I was overreacting to a harmless tradition. His sister said I was too sensitive and needed to learn to take a joke. Even my own parents seemed to think I was making a mistake, saying things like, all marriages have rough patches and don't throw away your relationship over one incident. But here's the thing. This isn't about cake. It's about the fact that I clearly stated a boundary multiple times. He promised he wouldn't cross it. And then he deliberately did exactly what I asked him not to do in front of everyone we know on what was supposed to be one of the most important days of our lives. How am I supposed to trust him about anything else? If he can lie to my face about this and then humiliate me for his amusement, what else will he do? What other promises will he break? What if we have kids someday and he thinks it's funny to embarrass them? And instead of genuinely apologizing, he's telling me I'm the problem for not finding my own humiliation funny. The day after the wedding, Jake finally came home to our apartment. He acted like everything was normal, like he expected me to just get over it. When I told him I was serious about the divorce, he got angry. He called me ungrateful, said I had no sense of humor, and that I was ruining his life over a stupid prank. He didn't even attempt to understand my perspective. I spent that night at my best friend Megan's place. I couldn't stand being around Jake anymore. I told her everything that had happened, and unlike everyone else, she actually understood why I was upset. She agreed that it wasn't about the cake itself, but about the complete disregard for my feelings and boundaries. Jake's brother, Frank, is literally the only other person who seems to understand and support my decision. I'm going through with a divorce or maybe an annulment since we've only been married for like 2 days, which someone mentioned might be possible. So, I decided to divorce my husband because he pushed my face into our wedding cake after I specifically asked him not to.